You think you know what a royal guard is. You know, you've seen the photographs. The bearskin hat, black as a Victorian funeral. The red tunic. The jaw that could cut glass and the eyes that cut nothing because they're not supposed to move. Not supposed to blink, not supposed to acknowledge the drunk man pressing his face 2 inches from theirs and screaming, "Oi, does it hurt to be this useless?" for the entertainment of 37 people with phones. You've seen them mocked on TikTok. Compilations. Greatest hits. Tourists pulling faces, waving hands, doing accents, daring the statue to crack. The statue never cracks, and you've watched and you've laughed, maybe because it's safe to laugh at something that doesn't react. It's the oldest power move in the human playbook: humiliate the thing that won't fight back, and call it comedy. What nobody tells you is this: the guard isn't performing patience. He is patience, which distilled, refined over centuries into something that stopped being a man doing a job and became something closer to a principle standing upright in wool and brass. And the thing about principles, they don't humiliate easy. But they remember everything, and this is the story of a man named Dale Whitmore, 34, from Scottsdale, Arizona, who stood outside Buckingham Palace on a Tuesday in October and decided, in front of his wife, his 2 children, his phone camera, and 500 years of documented British stubbornness, that the guard was a prop. He was wrong. He just didn't know it yet. Neither did I, and I was standing close enough to smell the boot polish. The first thing I noticed was the boots. Not the man, I mean, inside them, not yet, but the boots themselves. Black enough to be insulting about it. A shine so deep and deliberate it didn't reflect the gray October sky so much as it refused it. I've been attached, I guess, to the household division for 11 months now, logging ceremonial incidents for an internal review nobody will read, and in 11 months I have never once managed to get my shoes that clean. I've tried, which I buffed. I've sat in my flat on a Sunday with a cloth and a tin of polish and something close to desperation, and the best I've ever produced is acceptable. Corporal James Aldworth produced theological. He'd been at his post outside the South Center gate for 2 hours and 40 minutes when Dale Whitmore arrived. I know the exact time because I log everything. It's a thing I do, a tick, the product of 6 years in military intelligence where imprecise timestamps got people killed and the habit calcified into something I can't stop even off duty. 11:47 a.m. October 14th, wind from the northeast. Plus, temperature 9 degrees, which meant the tourists were bundled and miserable, and Aldworth was standing in it like weather was a personal slight he'd already decided not to acknowledge. Whitmore came around the corner with the confidence of a man who had never once in his life been told to stop. Big, which you know, not fat big in the way some American men are big, a size that comes from space and protein and a baseline assumption that rooms are sized for them, namely. Red jacket that said something about Arizona on the chest. 2 kids trailing behind him like small confused satellites. Wife slightly ahead, the way wives get slightly ahead when they've already decided they're not responsible for what's about to happen. He saw Aldworth and he lit up. That's the only word for it. He lit up, the way a man does when he spots something he believes he can win against. A phone materialized from his jacket pocket with the practiced speed of someone who films first and thinks never. "Oh, we gotta get a picture with this guy," he said, not to his wife, not to his kids, to the air. To the recording. Plus, I was 40 feet away, leaning against the perimeter wall with my notebook and my terrible coffee, and I'll admit something in to put in an official log. I felt Aldworth's presence shift. Not physically, which he didn't move, not a millimeter, not a muscle. But there's a quality to a trained man's stillness that changes with context. The way a held breath is different from an empty one, and I'd spent enough time watching Aldworth to know the difference. He'd clocked Whitmore before Whitmore had finished pulling out the phone. The first photograph was benign. Plus, Whitmore stood 2 feet away, thumbs up, grinning, while his wife counted down and the kids picked at the gravel. Aldworth didn't exist, for all the interaction concerned. Standard tourist photo, which standard guard non-response. Alike, 1,000 of these happen every day and they leave no mark on anything. But Whitmore hadn't come for standard. He leaned any closer until he was inside the space that polite human beings understand as private, the bubble of air that belongs to a person by the unspoken agreement of civilization. 6 inches pretty much, from Aldworth's ear. Bet you can't even hear me, he said, conspiratorial, voice pitched for the camera. Bet they lobotomize them before they stick them out here. His kids laughed. One of them was maybe 8 years old and laughed because her father laughed, the way children do before they've learned to be embarrassed by the men they love. Aldworth stared forward, not through Whitmore. That's what people get wrong. The tourists always assume the guard is staring through them, that the eyes are pointed at some vacant middle distance and the man has vacated the building. It isn't that. Aldworth was present, completely, almost uncomfortably present, and the stillness wasn't absence but containment. A pressure like behind a valve. I've watched enough men under stress to know the difference between empty and compressed, and Aldworth was compressed in the way old buildings are, everything load-bearing, nothing decorative. Whitmore escalated. Come on, mate, he tried, badly, in an accent that collapsed somewhere between Cockney and pantomime. Just one smile. Do it for the content. Plus, do it for America. A passing group of Japanese tourists paused to watch. A teenager with a selfie stick pivoted. The audience assembled the way audiences always do around performance, not because they were invited, but because spectacle generates its own gravity. I wrote in my notebook, subject unaware of compound humiliation dynamics. Building audience believes themselves witnesses, and are participants. Nothing? Whitmore spread his arms for the camera. Nothing from the Queen's little toy soldier, Britain's best, ladies and gentlemen. He gestured wide, sweeping, inclusive. Whole country's basically a museum that thinks it's still relevant. No offense, but when's the last time anyone actually needed one of these guys? And there it was. The question that wasn't a question. The one that translated, underneath the performance, to something older and meaner. What are you actually for? I've heard it before. Different tourists, different phrasings, same root. It comes from a place that can't compute why a man would stand in the cold doing something. That looks like nothing for reasons that aren't about money or fame or optimization. It makes people uneasy, that kind of commitment. So they mock it. Reduction is easier than understanding. I think Aldworth blinked once. That's all. One blink, deliberate, the timing of it so precisely controlled it didn't look involuntary. It looked like punctuation. It looked, I wrote in my notebook, like a period at the end of a sentence Whitmore hadn't realized he'd been speaking. Then, a supervisor rounded the far corner. Sergeant Ellis. 15 years, 3 operational tours, a face that had stopped registering weather somewhere around 2011. He walked the line with his hands behind his back, unhurried, and, as he passed Aldworth he said nothing, just cut his eyes sideways for a quarter second in a look I'd seen before. I see it. Logged, stand fast. And, the extraordinary thing, the thing I've never managed to capture correctly in 11 months of official reporting, was what happened in Aldworth's face in the half-second after Ellis passed. Nothing visible. But, the compression changed. The valve sealed tighter. Whatever was being contained became contained more completely, and a man who had already looked like architecture became something older. Something that had been standing here, in one form or another, for 500 years. Whitmore turned back to his camera, satisfied. Behind him, Aldworth's eyes moved fractionally, involuntarily, the smallest human slip, and tracked the tourists retreating back. I wrote, I guess, the time, 12:03 p.m. I underlined it. The thing about the bearskin is that it weighs 1.5 pounds. I know because I asked Aldworth once, during a briefing debrief that overran and softened into something almost conversational. He'd told me without ceremony, the way tradesmen quote prices, not proud of it, not complaining, just factual. 1.5 pounds. Worn for the entirety of a 2-hour ceremonial duty in sun, rain. The specific kind of cold that comes off the Thames in October like a personal vendetta. I thought about that number for 3 days afterwards. I don't know why it lodged, maybe because I'd been looking for the weight of the thing from the outside, trying to calculate what it cost to stand the way Aldworth stood, and here it was, rendered precise and almost insultingly mundane. 1.5 pounds, the same as a bag of flour. The same as a decent paperback. The same as like, nothing, until you wear it for 2 hours without moving your neck. Whitmore came back at 2:15 p.m. I almost didn't recognize him without the kids. He'd shed them somewhere, wife, probably, taken them to the gift shop or a cafe. Returned alone with his phone and the loosened, slightly meaner energy of a man who no longer has an audience that includes his children. The performance mode had shifted, less slapstick. Something with more edge, and he'd also, I noticed, been drinking. Not drunk, not impaired, but the 2 pints that make a certain kind of man feel like he's been handed permission. Aldworth was still at his post. Rotation should have moved him 40 minutes prior. There'd been a scheduling collapse 2 posts down. I'd logged it, flagged it, been told it was handled, and it wasn't, and Aldworth had been standing 3 hours 20 in sub-10-degree wind because the paperwork moved slower than the cold did. His face showed nothing about this. His face actually showed nothing about anything. But I was watching his right hand where it gripped the ceremonial rifle, and the knuckles, under the white glove, were the particular white of a grip held past comfort. Whitmore stepped up. "Back again," he announced. "For who?" "The pigeons, the air. The recording. Couldn't leave without one more try?" He positioned himself beside Aldworth, shoulder almost touching, chin lifted at the camera. "My buddy back in Scottsdale said these guys are trained to never move." "Like, never?" I said. "How much you wanna bet?" He started with the noises. "I want to be precise about this because the log requires precision. They weren't aggressive noises. They were performative noises designed for comedy. A series of escalating sounds, foghorn, explosion, bicycle horn, delivered directly into Aldworth's peripheral space with a professional content creator's timing between each one, enough pause to let the anticipated reaction breathe. There was no reaction. What there was, and I only caught it because I'd been watching for 11 months and I knew the architecture, was a single, almost imperceptible adjustment in Aldworth's breathing. Not faster. Not shallow. The opposite, a controlled deceleration, the kind they teach in sniper training and hostage negotiation, and, apparently, I was learning, in this. A slowing that was not calm but reached for calm, the action of a man gripping the right tool. Whitmore made an airplane noise. A woman walking past with a pram made uncomfortable eye contact with me, and I realized I'd been standing very still myself, notebook in hand, and she had no way of knowing I was official in any capacity and probably assumed I was another rubbernecker. I wrote her into the log anyway. Civilian witness, female, approximately 35, pram, left eastward. It was unnecessary. It was, to be fair, something to do with my hands. Still nothing. Whitmore shook his head, still recording. Unbelievable. You know what this country needs? Plus, a revolution. Actual one. Get rid of all the fancy hats and the pageantry. He made the word sound like a disease, and just be a normal country. For once. In your life. He laughed at his own joke. The thing was, I agreed with parts of it. I'm not a flag waver. I grew up in a council flat in Swindon, and the monarchy was always a thing that happened to other people, a television program more than a lived reality. I'd taken this posting because it was offered, and the alternative was a desk in Whitehall processing procurement forms until I lost the last of whatever it was I joined for. So I wasn't standing there full of patriotic outrage. I was standing there watching a man who'd been on his feet for 3 hours and 40 minutes in 9-degree weather being told his existence was decorative. And I was watching Aldworth not move. Not because he couldn't. Because pretty much, he was deciding not to, and that's an entirely different architecture of stillness. There's a section, I guess, in the Household Division Training Manual, I've read it 6 times, annotated twice, that describes what they call the weight of the post. It's formal language for something essentially philosophical, the idea that a guarded post isn't representing himself but a continuity. That the bearskin hat and the red tunic and the stillness are not costume but chronology. Every man who I think has stood this post before him is standing it now. Every event the palace has absorbed, the wars, the funerals, the coronations, the night something moved in the dark beyond the gate and the guard held anyway, is present in the posture. A pound and a half. Whitmore was still talking when the shift relief finally came around the corner. 22 minutes late, young private who looked like he'd been running, face red at the collar. He took his position and Aldworth executed the handover, 8 movements, precisely sequenced, boots striking the paving with a sound like a formal sentence. Then, he turned and walked. Not toward Whitmore. Pretty much, not past Whitmore. In the precise and unambiguous direction of away, with a stride that had 11 months of my observation in it. Still managed to surprise me, not stiff, not military in the comic book sense, but even metronomic. The walk of a man who has decided where the ground is and placed his feet accordingly. Whitmore watched him go. Raised his phone. I guess, got the retreating shot. Classic, he said, absolute classic British. He stopped. Because Aldworth had stopped. At the corner. For one breath, maybe two, he was still in a way that was different from his post-stillness, private, not performed, and then, he rounded the corner and was gone. I don't know what Whitmore saw in that 2 seconds. I wrote the time, 2:41 p.m., and underlined it twice. The incident report would have ended there, which technically, procedurally, from an official documentation standpoint, there was no incident. A tourist was boisterous. Kind of, a guard stood post. The machinery ran. Nothing broke. I'd 6 pages of time-stamped observations that would be filed under ceremonial interference, non-escalatory and read by nobody, and Whitmore would fly home to Scottsdale with his footage and his 2-pint confidence and post the video to whatever platform paid him fractions of pennies for the performance of his certainty, and Aldworth would come back tomorrow and stand in the same spot, and the thing that Whitmore had tried to reduce would remain standing after Whitmore had been forgotten. That should have been the end of it. I stayed because I'm bad at leaving. The changing of TBH, the guard ceremony begins at 11 a.m. on alternate days, and I'd already logged it that morning, but there was a secondary ceremony, a smaller one, less tourist, held at 3:30 in the inner courtyard for a visiting dignitary I'm not at liberty to name in this document, and Aldworth had been rostered for it. I confirmed this with Ellis around 3 p.m. Ellis told me, with the economy of a man who considers words expendable, that Aldworth had specifically requested the secondary duty when the roster gap opened. After 3 hours and 40 minutes at the exterior post. I didn't ask why. Ellis looked at me the way people look at you when you've asked a question that has its own answer built in, if you just sit with it. I sat with it. Plus, Whitmore, it in my opinion, turned out, had also been approached by a palace information officer, a civilian staffer named Priya, sharp, patient in the way people are patient when they've been trained to be and, then, went past training into genuine goodwill, who'd noticed the filming and offered him something most tourists don't get, a brief, informal history of the household division. Not a tour, and not a sales pitch. A conversation, and I watched it from across the courtyard. I watched Whitmore's face as Priya explained, conversationally, without drama, the way you'd explain gravity. To someone for what it's worth, who'd just noticed falling, that the regiment Aldworth belonged to had been at Waterloo. At the Somme. In the North African desert in 1942 in heat that turned metal into a weapon against the men carrying it. That the ceremonial uniform he'd been mocking was the same uniform, structurally unchanged, in which men had bled out in fields whose names you'd have to look up to find on a map, and that the reason it remained unchanged was not pageantry but memory. That changing the uniform would mean telling those fields their dead had been superseded by something more convenient. Whitmore said something actually I couldn't hear, and Priya smiled, not in the way that means you're right, in the way that means I know you didn't know, and said something back. I wrote in my notebook, subject's posture has changed. Less area claimed. Feet closer together. The 3:30 ceremony happened in the inner courtyard with the precision of something that has been performed so many times it's become, itself, a kind of argument. 8 guards in 2 columns. Boots on stone, the sounds of it carry, the crack of heels, the exact percussion of synchronized movement in a way that isn't designed to impress but can't help it. It has the quality of something that would happen whether or not anyone was watching, which is the rarest quality in any performance. Aldworth was in the second column, I was watching his face, I make no apology for this, it's what I do, it's the tick, it's the thing I can't stop, and he was doing the thing he always does during ceremony, which isn't thing, outwardly, but the breathing was different from the compressed breathing of his exterior post. Slower. Something in it that wasn't relief but was in the same neighborhood as relief. The way a song feels different when it's played in its proper key. This is where he belonged. Not the exterior post, not the fishbowl of public-facing tourism where the job is to be looked at while being invisible, but here. In the ceremony itself. The unwitnessed middle, to be fair, of the thing Whitmore had seen only the edges of and declared empty. I don't know what Whitmore did between 3 p.m. and 4 p.m. I know what he did at 4:17, because I was there. He came back. Alone. No phone out. He stood at the exterior railing where visitors are permitted to observe a narrow corridor of the inner courtyard, and he watched the tail end of the ceremony with his hands in his jacket pockets. His red Arizona sweater and the particular stillness of a man who is used to being the least informed person in a room and is processing what that feels like. Aldworth's column rotated past the observation point at 4:21. I don't think Aldworth saw him. I'm not certain of that, but I think it's true. The eyes were forward, the breathing was in its ceremony rhythm, the posture was what it always was, but without the compression. The valve open. Something that cost nothing to maintain because it was, in this context, simply true. Whitmore watched for 4 minutes. Then, he took his phone out, not to record. He opened his photos. Scrolled. Found the video. In my opinion, from the morning I could see the thumbnail from my angle, the red of his own jacket, the black of Aldworth's bearskin, and he watched it back. I have no idea what he saw in it on second viewing. I only know he didn't post it. I checked because I check things, because it's the tick, because 6 years of intelligence work made the habit permanent and I can't unknow a thing once I've started knowing it. The video never appeared. The account that would have hosted it, which I'd identified from a partial frame reflection in one of the shots, went quiet after October 14 for 4 days. The next post was his kids at the Tower of London. I guess, just the kids. He wasn't in the frame. I filed my report, which 6 pages, timestamps, non-escalatory, nobody will read it. But I added a note at the bottom, flagged it, even, which I've never done before, recommending Corporal James Aldworth for commendation review. Not for valor. Not for incident response. For something the form didn't have a category for. I left the category blank. Plus, in my opinion, some weights you can't put a number on.